I hadn't even recovered from my C-section when my husband filed for divorce. He looked at me, looked at our newborn son, and said words that haunted me for years. "You and that baby are just a burden to me." Then he walked away, boarded a plane with his mistress, and disappeared from our lives. 25 years later, he suddenly came back demanding to meet his son. But the moment he learned who my son was, the color drained from his face. The day my marriage ended should have been one of the happiest days of my life. Instead, it became the day I learned exactly who my husband really was. My name is Araminta Cresswell, and 25 years ago, I was lying in a hospital bed in Leeds, West Yorkshire, trying to recover from an emergency C-section after 32 exhausting hours of labor. The room smelt like disinfectant and stale coffee. Machines beeped softly around me, and every movement sent sharp pain through my abdomen. I remember staring at the tiny bassinet beside my bed and feeling completely overwhelmed. My son Alaric weighed barely 6 pounds. He was perfect. I was terrified. Like most first-time mothers, I had no idea what I was doing. I was exhausted, emotional, and worried about everything. Was he eating enough? Was he breathing normally? Was I holding him correctly? But every time those fears surfaced, I reminded myself that I wasn't alone. I had a husband. At least I thought I did. Gideon Cresswell and I had been married for 4 years. He worked in logistics management for a regional shipping company, and I handled administrative operations for a local insurance office. We weren't wealthy, we weren't glamorous, but I believed we were happy. Or maybe I only believed what I wanted to believe. Looking back, the signs had been there for months. The late nights, the unexplained business trips, the sudden passwords on his phone, the growing emotional distance. At the time, I blamed pregnancy stress. I told myself every marriage went through difficult seasons. I kept making excuses because the alternative was too painful to consider. 3 days after Alaric was born, Gideon finally arrived at the hospital. He carried no flowers, no balloons, no gifts. I remember feeling disappointed, but I pushed it aside. Maybe he was tired. Maybe work had been overwhelming. Maybe. The word maybe saved me from reality for far too long. He stood beside my bed for less than 5 minutes. He barely looked at Alaric. When I placed our son in his arms, Gideon held him awkwardly, almost like he was carrying someone else's child. Then he handed him back. "He's smaller than I expected," he said. I laughed nervously. Most newborns are. Gideon didn't smile. That should have frightened me. Instead, I convinced myself he was simply nervous about becoming a father. A week later, I was discharged. My mother drove me home because Gideon claimed he had an important meeting. The entire drive, my mother kept glancing at me. Finally, she asked, "Honey, is everything okay between you two?" I looked out the passenger window. "Why would you ask that?" "Because your husband looked like a man attending a dentist appointment, not a father meeting his newborn son." I forced a laugh. "You're imagining things." She wasn't. Mothers rarely are. 3 days later, Gideon came home carrying a leather briefcase. I was sitting on the sofa feeding Alaric. The television played quietly in the background, and afternoon sunlight spilled through the living room windows. It looked like an ordinary day. The kind of day people forget, the kind of day that changes everything. Gideon didn't sit down. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask about Alaric. Instead, he opened the briefcase and removed a stack of papers. Then, he placed them on the coffee table. I recognized the heading immediately. Petition for dissolution of marriage. For several seconds, I genuinely thought I was hallucinating. Pain medication, sleep deprivation, hormones. Any explanation seemed more reasonable than the truth sitting in front of me. "What is this?" I asked. Gideon exhaled slowly, a man preparing for an inconvenience, not a husband breaking his wife's heart. "It's a divorce filing." I stared at him. Then I stared at the papers. Then back at him. "No." The word escaped before I could stop it. "No." His expression never changed. "Araminta, we both know this isn't working." My hands began shaking. "What isn't working?" He rubbed his forehead. "Our marriage." I looked down at Alaric, sleeping peacefully against my chest. "We just had a baby." "Exactly." I felt something cold spread through my body. The kind of cold that comes from fear rather than temperature. Then he said the words that shattered whatever remained of my illusions. "There's someone else." The room became completely silent. Even the television seemed to disappear. I remember hearing only my own heartbeat. Loud, fast, unbelievable. "Someone else." Gideon nodded. We've been seeing each other for almost a year. A year. While I was pregnant, while I was planning a nursery, while I was attending doctor's appointments alone because he was supposedly working late. A year. The betrayal hit me so hard that I struggled to breathe. Who is she? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Gideon looked away. Her name is Serafina. I had heard that name before, a consultant his company worked with, a woman he had repeatedly assured me was only a colleague. Of course, it was always the colleague. I started crying. Not dramatic movie tears, not screaming, just quiet tears sliding down my face because the truth hurt too much. What about Alaric? Gideon's jaw tightened. For the first time, genuine irritation appeared on his face. And then came the sentence that stayed with me for the next 25 years. You and that baby are just a burden to me. The words landed like a physical blow. I felt sick. Not angry. Not yet. Just devastated. I looked down at my son. Tiny fingers, tiny face, tiny heartbeat. How could anyone look at him and see a burden? How could a father look at his own child and see a problem? Gideon continued talking. Something about freedom, something about opportunities, something about wanting a different life. Most of it blurred together because once someone tells you your child is a burden, nothing else they say matters. Eventually he left. I sat there alone for hours, my newborn son sleeping in my arms. My marriage lying in pieces on the coffee table. Outside, life continued as normal. Cars passed. Neighbors walked dogs. Children rode bicycles. The world didn't stop just because mine had collapsed. A month later, the divorce was finalized. Gideon moved out 2 months after that. He left the country with Serafina after accepting a position in Dubai. He never called, he never wrote, he never sent birthday cards, and he never paid a single pound in child maintenance. The first night after learning he had officially left the United Kingdom, I sat in the small nursery beside Alaric's cot. The room was dark, except for a nightlight shaped like a moon. I watched my son sleeping peacefully. Then I whispered something I would repeat countless times over the years. One day you'll understand this wasn't your fault. My voice trembled. And one day you'll know you were never a burden. At the time, I had no idea how difficult our journey would become. I also had no idea that the tiny baby sleeping in that cot would one day become the man capable of bringing his father to his knees without ever raising his voice. The first year after Gideon left felt less like living and more like surviving. People often talk about single motherhood as if it's a challenge that can be overcome with determination and love. What they don't always mention is the relentless exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones and becomes part of your identity. Every morning I woke up before sunrise. Every night I fell asleep worrying about money. And every day I reminded myself that Alaric deserved better than the circumstances he had been born into. When Alaric was 6 months old, I returned to work at the insurance office. Nursery costs nearly crushed me. After taxes and child-minding expenses, it sometimes felt like I was working simply to keep working. I remember standing in a supermarket one evening with a calculator in my hand, deciding which items could go back on the shelf. Fresh fruit or nappies, chicken or petrol money. Every pound mattered. One afternoon, my supervisor, Beryl, called me into her office. I immediately assumed I had done something wrong. Instead, she closed the door and handed me a small envelope. "What is this?" I asked. "A Christmas bonus." "It's October," she smiled. "I know." I opened the envelope. Inside was a check. Not a huge amount, but enough to cover the nursery for almost a month. My eyes immediately filled with tears. "Beryl," she held up a hand. "Don't." Then she added quietly, "Sometimes people need help, that's all." I never forgot that. Because when you're struggling, kindness feels enormous, especially when it comes from people who owe you nothing. By the time Alaric turned 4, we had settled into a rhythm. It wasn't easy, but it was ours. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom flat on the west side of Leeds. The carpet was old. The kitchen was tiny. The boiler made strange noises every winter. But it was home. Alaric loved that flat. To him, it wasn't small. It was where we built blanket forts in the living room, where we made pancakes on Saturday mornings, where we danced to old music while cleaning. Children measure wealth differently than adults. They count laughter instead of square footage. One evening, while I was washing dishes, Alaric looked up from the kitchen table. He was coloring dinosaurs. Very serious dinosaurs, the kind only a 4-year-old could create. "Mum." "Yeah, buddy, where's my dad?" The question froze me. I had known it would come eventually. I just wasn't prepared for how much it would hurt. I dried my hands slowly, then sat beside him. What made you think about that? He shrugged. Barnaby's dad came to school today. I nodded. And I don't have one. The innocence in his voice nearly broke my heart. I could have told him the truth. I could have told him that his father had abandoned him. I could have described the betrayal, the affair, the cruelty, the selfishness. But Alaric didn't need my anger. He needed stability. So, I chose my words carefully. You do have a father. Where is he? I hesitated, then answered honestly. He made different choices. Alaric thought about that, then asked, did I do something wrong? The question hit harder than any financial hardship ever had. I immediately pulled him into my lap. No, I said it firmly. No, Alaric. Never think that. Then why did he leave? I kissed the top of his head because sometimes adults make bad decisions. He seemed satisfied with that answer. At least for the moment. Children are remarkable that way. They don't always need complete explanations. They simply need reassurance that they're loved. As Alaric grew older, certain traits began emerging, traits that surprised everyone, including me. He was incredibly disciplined, not because I forced him to be, because he genuinely wanted to be. By secondary school, he had developed habits most adults struggled to maintain. Homework completed early, schedules organized, goals written down, teachers constantly praised his focus. One teacher even joked during a parents' evening, I wish half my students were as motivated as Alaric. I smiled politely, but privately I wondered where that drive came from, certainly not from Gideon. Then one night when Alaric was 13, I got my answer. I woke up around midnight and found his bedroom light still on. I knocked gently. Alaric. He looked up from his desk. Books were spread everywhere. What are you doing? Studying. It's midnight. He shrugged. I know. I sat on the edge of the bed. You don't need to work this hard. For a moment, he stared at his notebook. Then he said something that stunned me. I do. Why? His voice became quiet. Because nobody's coming to save us. I felt tears immediately threatening. Alaric. He looked away. I know we struggle, Mum. I didn't know what to say. I had spent years trying to shield him from our financial reality. Apparently, I hadn't been nearly as successful as I thought. I see the bills, he continued. I see you working all the time. I swallowed hard. You shouldn't have to worry about that. Maybe not, he paused. But I do. Then he looked directly at me. And one day, I won't let you worry anymore. At 13 years old, my son had already decided who he wanted to become. Not because he wanted money, not because he wanted status, because he wanted security, for both of us. When Alaric turned 16, another turning point arrived. One afternoon, I came home and found him sitting at the kitchen table. Several documents lay spread out before him. The expression on his face immediately alarmed me. Alaric. He looked up slowly. What's child maintenance? My stomach dropped. I recognized the paperwork instantly. Old legal files, court records, documents I thought were hidden, documents I thought he'd never see. I sat down carefully. Where did you find those? In the filing cabinet. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course. The one cabinet I never expected him to open. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Alaric tapped one document. He never paid. The disappointment in his voice hurt far more than anger would have. I nodded. No, not once. No. Silence filled the room. Eventually, Alaric leaned back in his chair. He really didn't want us. The statement wasn't emotional. It was observational. As though he were finally assembling pieces of a puzzle, I reached across the table. That's not true. He looked at me. Then why didn't he come back? I had no answer, at least not one that would heal anything. So I told the truth. I don't know. For the first time, genuine pain appeared on his face, not because he missed Gideon, because he realized he had never mattered to him. That realization changes a person. Sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. Fortunately, Alaric chose the second path. Instead of becoming bitter, he became determined. Instead of chasing approval, he focused on achievement. Instead of obsessing over the father who left, he invested in the future he could create. During his final year of sixth form, Several included bursary packages. The day the acceptance letter arrived from a highly respected business program, Alaric walked into the kitchen holding the envelope. His hands were shaking. Mine were too. We opened it together. Then we both started crying because for the first time in years, the future felt bigger than our struggles. A few weeks later, I sat in the audience during his graduation ceremony. As Alaric crossed the stage to receive his degree, everyone stood and applauded. I clapped until my hands hurt. Not because my son was graduating, because I remembered the newborn baby his father had called a burden. And now that same child was walking confidently toward a future nobody could take away from him. I didn't know exactly where life would lead him next. But I knew one thing. Gideon Cresswell had abandoned the greatest thing he would ever have. And someday, whether he realized it or not, that decision was going to cost him more than he could imagine. The day I dropped Alaric off at university, I cried the entire drive home. Not because I was worried about him. Quite the opposite. For the first time in his life, I wasn't worried at all. As I watched him carry boxes into his halls of residence, confidently introducing himself to strangers who would soon become friends, I realized something important. My son didn't need me the way he once had. And while that realization hurt a little, it also felt like victory. For 20 years, every major decision I made had revolved around protecting him. Now, he was stepping into a future he had earned entirely on his own. I couldn't have been prouder. What I didn't realize at the time was that university wouldn't simply shape Alaric's future. It would reveal who he truly was. From the beginning, he approached university differently than most students. While many freshers spent weekends partying, Alaric spent them networking. While others focused exclusively on marks, he focused on solving problems. During his first term, he called me almost every Sunday. Not because he needed money, not because he was homesick, because he wanted to tell me about ideas. Always ideas. One weekend, he called excitedly. Mom. Have you ever noticed how inefficient shipping companies are? I laughed. That's your opening line. I'm serious. Most university kids call home to ask for laundry advice. Well, I have a theory. I settled onto my sofa. Let's hear it. For 40 minutes, Alaric explained supply chains, logistics, software, route optimization, and inventory management. Most of it went over my head, but his excitement didn't. There was something different in his voice, something alive, the same determination I'd seen when he was 13, studying after midnight. Only now it had direction. By his second year, he had assembled a small group of students who shared his interests. 3 young men and 1 young woman. Different backgrounds, different personalities, one common trait. They were ambitious, very ambitious. Whenever Alaric came home for holidays, their names appeared constantly in conversation. Callum, Tarquin, Amita, Piers. They weren't just friends. They were building something together. At least they hoped they were. The summer before his final year, Alaric sat across from me at our kitchen table. The same table where he had once discovered the child maintenance records. The same table where we had shared countless meals. This time he looked nervous, which immediately worried me. What's wrong? I asked. Nothing. Then why do you look like you're about to confess to a crime? He laughed, then took a deep breath. We're starting a company. I blinked. A real company? A real company? While you're still in uni? He nodded. I stared at him for several seconds. Then asked the obvious question. With what money? He smiled. We're working on that. I should have been concerned, maybe even skeptical. Instead, I felt strangely calm because Alaric wasn't impulsive. Never had been. If he believed in something strongly enough to take a risk, there was probably a reason. What does the company do? I asked. His eyes immediately lit up. That was always a good sign. For the next hour, he explained a software platform designed to help smaller logistics companies compete with larger corporations. The technology would improve route planning, inventory forecasting, and delivery efficiency. Once again, much of the technical language escaped me, but one thing was clear. He knew exactly what he was talking about. When he finally finished, I smiled. So, what do you need from me? He looked surprised. You believe I can do this? I laughed. Alaric, after everything I've watched you accomplish, it would be ridiculous not to. For a moment, his expression softened. Then he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That small gesture meant more than he probably realized because despite all his confidence, part of him still needed reassurance. Just like everyone else. The startup launched 6 months after graduation. The first year was brutal. There is a myth in the United Kingdom that successful entrepreneurs move smoothly from idea to fortune. Reality is much messier. Alaric and his partners worked ridiculous hours. 80-hour weeks became normal. Investors rejected them. Potential clients ignored them. Cash flow remained dangerously tight. Several times I feared the entire business would collapse. One evening, Alaric showed up at my flat unexpectedly. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying responsibility too long. I made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, he sighed. We might be out of money in 3 months. I sat down across from him. How bad is it? Pretty bad. The silence that followed felt heavy. Then Alaric laughed unexpectedly. Not because anything was funny. Because sometimes people laugh when they're afraid. You know what's strange? What? I still think we're going to make it. I smiled. Then you probably will. He shook his head. That's not exactly solid business advice. No. I took a sip of coffee. But I've known you for 22 years. His smile returned. Small, tired, genuine. The company survived those first difficult years, largely because Alaric refused to quit. The same stubborn determination that carried him through childhood now carried him through entrepreneurship. Then everything changed. A regional transportation company agreed to test their software. The results exceeded expectations. Costs dropped. Efficiency improved. Word spread. More clients signed contracts. Revenue increased. Investors suddenly became interested. Within 18 months, the startup transformed from a struggling business into one of the fastest-growing logistics technology companies in the region. The growth felt almost surreal. New offices, new employees, new opportunities. For the first time, Alaric wasn't merely surviving. He was winning. One Saturday afternoon, he picked me up without explanation. "Where are we going?" I asked. "It's a surprise. I hate surprises." "No, you don't, that's true." We drove across town. Eventually, he pulled into a quiet suburban neighborhood filled with mature trees and well-maintained homes. I looked around, confused. Then Alaric parked. "We're here." "Size." "Where?" He pointed. I followed his finger. The house was beautiful. Nothing extravagant, just warm, comfortable. The kind of home people stay in for decades. I frowned. "Whose house is that?" He smiled. "Yours." For several seconds, I genuinely couldn't process the words. "What?" "It's yours, Alaric." He handed me a folder. Inside were documents, property records, mortgage paperwork, ownership information, everything. I stared at the pages, then at him, then back at the pages. My vision blurred. "You bought me a house." His voice grew quiet. "You spent your whole life making sure I had a home." A tear rolled down my cheek. "Mom, I just wanted to return the favor." I cried harder than I had in years. Not because of the house, because of what it represented. Security, stability, peace. The very things I'd spent 25 years trying to create for him. Now he was giving them back to me. Over the next few years, Alaric's company continued expanding. Several major investment firms provided substantial funding. The business evolved from a software startup into a broader logistics solutions company. By age 25, Alaric had become the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing logistics technology firms in the north of England. The company wasn't a giant corporation, not yet, but it was highly respected, financially strong, and increasingly influential. One area of growth involved acquiring struggling logistics businesses and integrating them into their expanding network. It was smart business. Many smaller companies possessed valuable infrastructure but lacked modern technology. Alaric's company could provide both capital and operational expertise. The strategy worked remarkably well. As a result, his influence grew. Industry publications featured interviews with him. Business journals highlighted his success. Investors praised his leadership. Yet despite everything, Alaric remained fundamentally the same person. Disciplined, grounded, focused. He still called me every Sunday. Still visited regularly. Still remembered where he came from. Then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. I was planting flowers in my back garden. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I would have ignored it. "For reasons I still can't explain," I answered. Hello. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a man's voice spoke. A voice I hadn't heard in 25 years. Araminta. My entire body froze. The gardening gloves slipped from my hands. And suddenly, the past wasn't 25 years away anymore. It was standing right in front of me. My God, the voice said quietly. It's really you. For several seconds after hearing his voice, I couldn't speak. I stood in my back garden, holding a half-finished tray of flowers, while 25 years of memories crashed into me all at once. The hospital room, the divorce papers, the empty nursery, the birthdays he missed, the school plays, the graduations, the years, so many years. And now suddenly, Gideon Cresswell was on the phone, as if he had merely been gone for a long weekend. Araminta, he repeated. I finally found my voice. What do you want? The question came out colder than I intended. Then again, perhaps it didn't. 25 years tends to remove the need for politeness. Gideon exhaled. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. That's one accurate thing you've said so far. Silence followed. Awkward. Heavy. Deserved. Finally, he spoke again. I'd like to see you. No. The answer came instantly. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just no. Araminta. No. I picked up my gardening gloves. You disappeared for 25 years. I know you never called. I know you never paid child maintenance. Another pause. I know the fact that he admitted it somehow made me angrier. There was no defense, no excuse, no attempt to rewrite history, just an acknowledgement of guilt. And somehow that wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough. I have to go, I said. Wait. Something in his voice stopped me. Not affection, not nostalgia, desperation. I want to meet my son. There it was, the real reason for the call. Not me, never me. Alaric, the child he had abandoned, the burden, the inconvenience, the baby he hadn't wanted. Now suddenly he wanted a relationship. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked the question that mattered. Why? Gideon didn't answer immediately, and that told me everything. People with honest motives answer simple questions quickly. People with hidden motives need time. Too much time. Eventually, he said, Because he's my son. No, my voice sharpened. He's my son. You forfeited the right to make that claim a long time ago. The silence on the other end stretched. Then Gideon spoke quietly. I deserve that. Maybe he did, but hearing him say it didn't make me feel better. Nothing about this conversation felt satisfying. After 25 years, I had imagined many scenarios. Gideon apologizing, Gideon begging forgiveness, Gideon expressing regret. None of them had prepared me for how emotionally exhausting his actual return would be. Finally, I ended the call. Not angrily, not dramatically, simply because I had nothing else to say. That evening, Alaric came over for dinner. As usual, he arrived carrying dessert despite repeated instructions not to. You're impossible, I told him. So, I've been told. We sat on the back patio while the sun disappeared behind the trees. For a while, we talked about ordinary things, work, weather, a football match, normal life. Then I finally said it. Your father called today. The change in Alaric's expression was immediate. Not shock, not excitement, something closer to curiosity. Really? I nodded. He wants to meet you. Alaric leaned back in his chair. For several moments, he said nothing. Then he asked the same question I had. Why? I don't know. That wasn't entirely true. I had suspicions. Strong ones. But I didn't have proof. And after everything Gideon had already taken from us, I wasn't willing to speculate. Alaric looked out across the garden. Thoughtful, calm, far calmer than I would have been at his age. What did you tell him? That he waited 25 years too long. A small smile appeared. Fair. I studied my son's face. You're not angry. He considered that, then shrugged. I was angry when I was 16. Another pause. I was hurt when I was 16. His voice remained steady. But I'm 25 now. I realized he was right. The absence that had once wounded him no longer defined him. Gideon had become a historical fact rather than an emotional force, like a storm that had passed years ago. Its damage remained, but its power did not. What do you want to do? I asked. Alaric thought carefully before answering. I'll meet him. I blinked. You will? He nodded. Not because he deserves it. The distinction mattered. A lot of questions never got answered, Mum. He wasn't wrong. For 25 years, there had been an empty chair in our story. Not a necessary chair, not an important chair, but an empty one, nevertheless. Perhaps Alaric deserved the chance to look directly at the man who had walked away. A week later, Gideon arrived in Leeds. The first thing I noticed was how much older he looked. The second thing I noticed was how tired he looked. Life had not been particularly kind to him. The confidence I remembered was gone. The arrogance was gone. Even his posture seemed different, bent slightly by time and disappointment. We met at a quiet restaurant. Neutral territory. Safe territory. Gideon stood as Alaric approached the table. For a moment, neither man spoke. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. Same height, same eyes, same jawline. 25 years earlier, Gideon had refused to see himself in his son. Now he had no choice. My God, Gideon whispered. Alaric extended his hand. Nice to meet you. The formality hit harder than any insult could have. Gideon shook his hand slowly. You've grown into a remarkable man. Alaric sat down. That's what happens over 25 years. The statement wasn't hostile, which somehow made it more powerful. The conversation that followed remained polite, painfully polite. Gideon asked about university, about work, about life. Alaric answered briefly, respectfully, without offering anything deeper. It was the conversational equivalent of a locked door. Then eventually, the truth began to emerge. Not all at once, little pieces, fragments, enough for me to see the larger picture. Gideon's life abroad had not unfolded the way he once imagined. His relationship with Serafina had ended years earlier. Several business ventures had failed. Poor investments had drained much of his savings. More recently, he had returned to the United Kingdom to run a small logistics company inherited through a complicated business arrangement. Unfortunately, the company was struggling badly. Revenue was declining, debt was increasing, competition was overwhelming them. The deeper Gideon explained, the clearer everything became. This wasn't just a reunion, it was a crisis, and desperate people often rediscover family. After the meeting ended, Alaric and I walked to the car park together. Neither of us spoke until we reached our cars. Then Alaric stopped. You were right about what? He didn't come back because he missed me. The sadness in his voice surprised me, not because he still wanted a father, because confirmation hurts even when you already know the answer. What makes you say that? Alaric looked toward the restaurant. Every time he talked about his life, the conversation eventually returned to his company. I thought about that, then nodded. I noticed. So did I. We stood there quietly. Then Alaric sighed. He's scared. He should be. A faint smile appeared. Maybe. The following Monday, Alaric attended a quarterly executive meeting at company headquarters. Like most of his meetings, it involved acquisition opportunities. Several struggling logistics businesses had approached them seeking partnerships, investments, or buyouts. One company in particular had recently been added to the agenda: Northern Freight Solutions. The moment Alaric saw the name, he froze. Because it was Gideon's company, the same company Gideon had spent most of dinner discussing. The same company currently drowning in debt. The same company desperately searching for rescue. According to the report, bankruptcy was becoming increasingly likely. Without outside investment, the business probably wouldn't survive another 6 months. Later that evening, Alaric called me. I learned something interesting today. His tone immediately caught my attention. What happened? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mom, my company is reviewing an acquisition proposal. Okay. It's his company. I stopped breathing for a second. What? My father's company? The words hung between us. Heavy, complicated, unavoidable, and suddenly 25 years after walking away from his son, Gideon Cresswell had no idea that the very person capable of saving his future was the child he had once called a burden. For the next several days, neither Alaric nor I talked much about Gideon. Not because the situation wasn't important, because it was perhaps too important. Some subjects carry so much emotional weight that discussing them immediately only creates confusion. Sometimes people need space to think before they speak. This was one of those times. Meanwhile, business continued moving forward. At Alaric's company, acquisition evaluations followed a structured process. Financial analysts reviewed records. Attorneys examined liabilities. Operations teams assessed infrastructure and workforce potential. No company received special treatment, not even Gideon's. Especially not Gideon's. One Thursday evening, Alaric came by my house after work. He looked thoughtful, not angry, not conflicted, thoughtful. We sat on the back porch as the summer air settled around us. For a while, we watched fireflies flicker across the garden. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my mind all week. "What are you going to do?" Alaric leaned back in his chair. "I honestly don't know yet." That answer surprised me. Normally, he was decisive. Very decisive. But this wasn't merely a business decision. It was personal. Deeply personal. "I assume your board knows about the connection." He nodded. "The legal department does. And they immediately created safeguards." That made sense. Any competent company would. "Are you allowed to participate?" "Yes." He paused. "But everything has to be documented." I nodded slowly. That was reassuring because regardless of what happened, I never wanted anyone to say Alaric had abused his position. He had worked too hard for that. Eventually, Alaric sighed. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I spent years imagining what I'd say if I ever met him. I waited. But now that he's actually here, I don't have much to say." The statement felt profoundly sad. Not because Alaric lacked anger, because he had outgrown it. The man who had abandoned him no longer occupied enough space in his heart to inspire hatred. There was disappointment. There was hurt. There was history. But hatred requires emotional investment. And Gideon had lost the right to that long ago. A few days later, Alaric received the final acquisition report. The conclusion was straightforward. Northern Freight Solutions possessed valuable regional contracts, experienced employees, and useful infrastructure. However, poor leadership decisions had pushed the company dangerously close to collapse. If acquired and properly managed, it could become profitable again. If left alone, bankruptcy appeared likely. The recommendation favored acquisition, not because of Gideon, because of the business itself. Several hundred employees depended on it. Families depended on it. Communities depended on it. The numbers were clear. The opportunity made sense. A formal meeting was scheduled for the following week. Gideon would present directly to Alaric's executive team. What Gideon didn't know was that Alaric would personally attend. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and overcast. I spent the entire day distracted, unable to focus, unable to relax. By lunchtime, I had reorganized my kitchen cupboards twice. At 3 o'clock, I gave up pretending to be productive and simply waited. Around 4:30, my phone rang. It was Alaric. I answered immediately. "How did it go?" There was a brief silence. Then he said, "You wouldn't believe it." My heart started racing. "What happened?" Another pause. And then Alaric laughed. Not cruelly, not bitterly, just with genuine disbelief. "Mum, what?" He had no idea. I sat down. "Tell me everything." The conference room occupied the top floor of the company's headquarters. Glass walls, long polished table, city skyline visible through the windows. Professional, impressive, exactly the kind of environment Gideon probably hoped would save his business. According to Alaric, Gideon arrived early, nervous but optimistic. His company desperately needed help, and this acquisition represented his best chance. Several executives entered first, then legal counsel, then finance personnel, finally Alaric. The moment he walked through the door, the room went completely silent. Gideon froze. Literally froze. For a second, he appeared unable to process what he was seeing. His eyes widened. His face lost color, and the carefully prepared speech in front of him became completely irrelevant. "Alaric," the word barely emerged. Alaric nodded politely. "Good morning." Gideon looked around the room, then back at Alaric, then around the room again, as though reality itself had suddenly changed. "You're the CEO?" "Yes." Several seconds passed. No one spoke. No one needed to. The significance of the moment filled the room. 25 years earlier, Gideon had looked at a newborn child and seen a burden. Now he was staring at the same child sitting at the head of a boardroom table. The child he abandoned, the child he ignored, the child he never supported, And that child now possessed more influence over Gideon's future than anyone else on Earth. Eventually, Gideon lowered himself into his chair slowly, almost mechanically. According to Alaric, his hands were shaking. The meeting began. Professional, structured, objective, exactly as company policy required. Gideon presented financial projections, recovery plans, growth opportunities, potential synergies. He did his best. To his credit, he genuinely tried, but the emotional reality of the situation hung over everything. Every sentence, every slide, every number. Finally, the formal presentation ended. Questions followed. Most came from finance executives, operations specialists, attorneys. Then Alaric spoke for the first time all morning. The room became quiet, not because he was the CEO, because everyone understood the history. Alaric, Gideon said carefully. Yes, Gideon swallowed, then asked the question that had apparently been consuming him. Why didn't you tell me? Alaric considered that, then answered honestly, you never asked. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted because there was nothing to add. The statement landed with devastating simplicity. You never asked. Not when Alaric was 1. Not when he was 5. Not when he was 10. Not when he graduated. Not when he went to university. Not during 25 years of silence. Gideon looked down at the table. For the first time, there was no defense left. No explanation, no justification. Just consequences. Then Alaric did something unexpected. He opened a folder. Inside were copies of public records, child maintenance judgments, court documents, historical filings, nothing confidential, nothing dramatic, simply facts. He slid them across the table. Gideon stared at them. His expression changed immediately because the paperwork represented something impossible to argue with. Evidence, dates, numbers, years, an entire lifetime documented on paper. You never paid any of it, Alaric said quietly. Gideon's eyes filled with shame. I know you never called. I know you never wrote. I know. The repetition continued, each answer smaller than the last, each acknowledgement carrying the weight of a quarter century. Finally, Gideon looked up. His voice cracked just slightly. Alaric, I'm sorry. No one in the room moved. The apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was simply a broken man, confronting the truth and for perhaps the first time in his life accepting responsibility. I know that doesn't fix anything, Gideon continued. It doesn't. I know. Silence followed. Long, uncomfortable, necessary. Then Gideon asked the question everyone expected. The question that ultimately mattered. What happens now? The room waited. The executives waited. Gideon waited because the answer belonged to Alaric. And after 25 years, the son Gideon abandoned was finally the one holding all the power. When Alaric told me about that moment later, he said the room felt strangely quiet, not the ordinary silence of a business meeting. Something deeper. The kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they're witnessing more than a corporate decision. They were watching 25 years of consequences arrive all at once. Gideon sat at the far end of the conference table. The acquisition documents remained spread in front of him. The child maintenance records sat beside them. Past and present, failure and opportunity, all within arm's reach. And for perhaps the first time in his life, there was nowhere left for him to hide. What happens now? Gideon had asked. Alaric looked around the room before answering, not because he needed time, because he wanted everyone present to understand that his next words were being spoken as a CEO, not as an abandoned son. Finally, he said, we continue evaluating the acquisition based on what's best for the company. Several executives nodded. The answer was professional, expected, correct. But Gideon looked devastated. Not because of the business implications, because he suddenly understood something. Alaric wasn't seeking revenge, and somehow that hurt more. The meeting concluded shortly afterward. The executive team remained behind to discuss the final recommendation. Gideon left the building alone. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no humiliation. Just a man walking out into a rainy afternoon carrying the full weight of his own decisions. 3 days later, Alaric called me. It's done. I immediately knew what he meant. What was the decision? We approved the acquisition. I blinked. Really? Yes. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. After everything Gideon had done, part of me had expected Alaric to walk away. Not out of cruelty, out of self-protection. Instead, he had chosen a different path. Why? I finally asked. Alaric's answer came immediately. Because 300 employees shouldn't lose their jobs because of one man's mistakes. I closed my eyes. That sounded exactly like him. Not because he was weak, because he understood the difference between justice and collateral damage. Many revenge stories end with destruction. Real life is more complicated. The lorry drivers working for Gideon's company weren't responsible for what he did. Neither were the dispatchers, the mechanics, the office staff, the warehouse workers. They had families, mortgages, children. Alaric wasn't willing to punish innocent people simply to satisfy old pain. The acquisition moved forward over the following months. Operations were restructured. Technology systems were upgraded. Inefficiencies were eliminated. Gradually, the company stabilized. Then it became profitable. Just as Alaric's analysts had predicted, Gideon remained with the organization during the transition, but not as an owner, not as a chief executive, not as a decision-maker. He became a regional operations manager, reporting through several layers of leadership, including people young enough to be his children. Life has a remarkable sense of irony. Several weeks after the acquisition closed, Alaric asked if I would join him for dinner. When I arrived at the restaurant, I discovered we weren't alone. Gideon was there. For a brief moment, I considered leaving. Then I looked at Alaric. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't upset. He simply seemed ready. So, I stayed. Dinner began awkwardly. There was no way around that. 25 years of history doesn't disappear because people share starters. Still, everyone made an effort. Conversation remained polite, measured, careful. Eventually, Alaric excused himself to take a phone call. That left Gideon and me sitting across from each other, alone. For the first time in decades, Gideon stared down at his coffee cup. Then he spoke. "I owe you an apology." I didn't respond. I had heard apologies before, not from him, from others. And I had learned that words matter less than actions. I was selfish, he continued. That's true. I thought I was chasing freedom. His laugh carried no humor. I was really running from responsibility. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Gideon looked up. His eyes appeared older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. Regret ages people. I missed everything. The statement was simple but devastating. I missed his first steps. I said nothing. I missed birthdays. Silence. I missed graduation. More silence. Finally, he shook his head. And now I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I can never get any of that back. That was the first moment I truly believed he understood. Not because he felt sorry for himself, because he finally understood the cost. The greatest punishment wasn't losing money or losing status or losing his company. It was realizing he had voluntarily abandoned the most important relationship of his life. No court could have imposed a harsher sentence. A few minutes later, Alaric returned. The conversation shifted. The evening continued and eventually dinner ended. Outside, under the soft glow of the car park lights, Gideon turned toward me, toward both of us. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. Neither Alaric nor I interrupted, but I'm asking for it anyway. The request hung in the air, heavy, honest, uncomfortable, real. I looked at my son, then back at Gideon. 25 years earlier, I had hated him. For a long time afterward, I had resented him. Then eventually, I stopped thinking about him altogether. Somewhere along the way, anger had become unnecessary. Life had moved forward. Healing had happened. Not because he deserved it, because I deserved peace. Finally, I answered, I forgive you. Gideon closed his eyes. Relief washed across his face. Then I added, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. He nodded immediately. I know, and for once I believed him. The months that followed weren't magical. There was no instant family reunion, no perfect reconciliation. Real life rarely works that way. Gideon and Alaric met occasionally, sometimes for lunch, sometimes for coffee. Slowly, carefully, they built something resembling a relationship, not a father and son bond restored. That chapter was gone forever. Something new, something smaller, something honest. And perhaps that was enough. One Sunday afternoon, nearly a year later, Alaric and I sat on my back porch, watching a summer storm roll across the horizon. The same porch where we had shared countless conversations over the years. I glanced toward him. You know, I said, a lot of people would have handled things differently. He smiled. I know. You could have destroyed him. I could have. The answer came without hesitation, because it was true. He absolutely could have. Instead, he watched the distant rain clouds gathering beyond the trees. Then he said something I'll never forget. If I had destroyed him, I'd still be carrying him around. I frowned. What do you mean? Alaric leaned back in his chair. For 25 years, he let his choices define his life. He paused. I'm not going to let those same choices define mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I smiled, because in that instant I realized something. Gideon's greatest mistake wasn't abandoning his son. His greatest mistake was failing to see who his son would become. Not a CEO, not a successful businessman, not a respected leader, a good man. And that's a loss no amount of money can ever replace. Sometimes karma arrives with thunder. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it takes 25 years, but eventually every choice asks to be accounted for. Gideon learned that the hard way. And Alaric proved something even more important. Success isn't measured by how completely you defeat the people who hurt you. It's measured by whether you become the kind of person they never believed you could be. That was the real victory, and that was the revenge that mattered. If this story touched you, take a moment to think about the choices we make and the people who depend on us. Sometimes a single decision can shape decades of someone's life. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever seen karma come full circle in a way no one expected? And if you enjoy stories about resilience, justice, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next.